Welcome back, everyone. It's been a while. It's been a while since I've done a video like this that's not an AI video or like an MLC video. So good to see you all again. Today we're talking about how to beat TurboNaus. I don't know how to talk about how to beat TurboNaus. Other people have talked about it before. But what makes this video special is I actually don't also own an Ad Nauseam, which I think we should fix. But anyways, but what makes this video special is that we're talking about how to beat TurboNaus as told by TurboNaus players. It's going to cover some common misconceptions I think people have about TurboNaus as told by the brewers and pilots of TurboNaus archetypes, and also what really hampers their strategies, I guess, what really disrupts them when they're playing these TurboNaus decks. So it's not from the perspective of people playing against TurboNaus, it's purely from the perspective of people who actually play the archetype. So let's get into it. I don't know if I need to explain this, but I'll do it anyways for people who don't know what I'm talking about. What is TurboNaus? TurboNaus is basically an archetype within cEDH that, as you can imagine from the two words, is to quickly, Turbo and Ad Naus, is to quickly play an Ad Nauseam. This has been expanded to also include things like Peer into the Abyss. Just basically finding means to quickly cast either of those spells where you draw most of your deck, and then from there you chain a bunch of rituals and rocks to then continue to find your win con or play your win con out. These days, oftentimes it's an Underworld Breach line. That is the easiest and most flexible way to win after an Ad Nauseam or a Peer into the Abyss, but you can also do it as simply with like a Thassa's Oracle and Consultation. It's a little bit more difficult because of the blue-black versus like just the red and colorless that you would need for Underworld Breach. But that's the archetype behind the idea, or that's the idea behind the archetype. It's just quickly being able to cast both of those spells. It's more of a thing that people talk about these days because TurboNaus, it did exist, I believe, before the flash ban in 2020, but it was the flash ban during Ikoria that we really noticed what TurboNaus is within the meta of cEDH. So I've mentioned this a couple times while casting or in other videos before, but like BlueFarm was a thing during, like, I forgot which tournament now, though, but Flash was legal and BlueFarm still existed back then. We just didn't pay as much attention to it, but TurboNaus has always been a thing for a little while. And before, Ad Nauseam used to be more well known for man decks, which is mid-range Ad Nauseam. If you've played a little while ago, maybe like 2018, 2019, you might remember these. They're just more grindy versions of just like combo decks that plays Ad Nauseam on an end step, and then afterwards you continue to like win that way. You might play your Ad Nauseam for value as well. Nowadays, TurboNaus decks plays Ad Nauseam or Pre in the Abyss on their main phase, and you're able to win very easily from that. I think that's what kind of differentiates like a TurboNaus list from like a, I don't know, mid-range Ad Nauseam list. It's just the ability to be able to easily win off of like your main phase Ad Nauseam. Back to mid-range Ad Nauseam, if you want to see what a list looks like for like a man deck, there's a He-Man by Labman Luke. I don't know if you should like apply the titles before, but Luke and Siggy from the Labman made that list. I think that's a good example of what a man list looks like. That sounds really weird, but what a mid-range Ad Nauseam looks like. And ever since Red started getting a lot more better like spells or like rituals, and I'm considering Dockside Ritual here. You have Jessica's Will, Dockside Extortionist, Underworld Breach. Like Red became so powerful, and it's so much easier now to be able to just kind of play your Ad Nauseam and win on the same turn. I think it's safe to say that generally across most metas, playing proactively is easier to win just because your deck is naturally trying to get you there versus learning how to like play around things better to like really excel playing reactively. So I think TurboNaus is just really popular right now because I think I was talking about Ikoria and the flash ban. I just stopped talking about it afterwards, so let's go back there real quick. After the flash ban, Flash really pushed players to play more reactively because even though the threat of a really fast, Flash Hulk was I guess available, the threat kind of worked both sides. So you have two Flash Hulk decks sitting against each other. You don't want to jam out that Flash immediately because they can do the same thing and win right underneath you. So those games tend to go grindier, which I think is one of the more difficult kind of metas for a TurboNaus deck to play into, because I think the perception is that TurboNaus does really well when everyone plays greedy, taps out, doesn't have interaction, and then you just kind of win out of nowhere. But back then, everyone was playing a really grindy game, trying to play really carefully to make sure that they probably have more interaction than the other Flash Hulk players, so that in those kind of situations, it's a little bit more difficult to, I think it's perceived, a little bit more difficult for TurboNaus to kind of excel in that situation. But without Flash Hulk, with Flash Hulk being banned, a lot more mid-range decks are showing up. We saw like a lot of Pacos, we saw a bunch of like, I guess other lists being experimented with and people being a little bit more greedy or like trying out these different strategies that TurboNaus really came in and just kind of swept everything because people weren't really playing as carefully, I guess, than when they used to play against Flash Hulk. So TurboNaus kind of became this big boogeyman, boogie person. Just kind of really scary list. People who haven't seen a TurboNaus list before will see it in action. They might not even kind of be able to like understand the threat of a TurboNaus list being able to like play turn 1, mana vault, land. You have to have a land. You get the idea. Basically, like how easy it is for you to explode over a TurboNaus list. People weren't really used to seeing that. So once you see it for the first time, you're like, wow, that's really strong. And I think you need to lose a couple of times to TurboNaus to really understand how consistent and easy it is for you to execute that combo. I think a lot of new players who look at TurboNaus list will say like, well, that's great if you get the perfect hand. If you don't get the perfect hand, you know, the deck's not as good. But if you play enough against TurboNaus, you'll see that the pilots generally know how to mulligan for an easy Ad Nauseam. So kind of quick history lesson, I guess, or background on TurboNaus. And with all these different TurboNaus lists out right now, there's a really big focus into how we fight TurboNaus. There's a lot of rule of law lists or a lot of stacks lists playing rule of law, also considering other stacks pieces like, I guess, Thalia or like tax effects that just reduce the amount of actions a TurboNaus list can take to just disrupt them enough so that you can win yourself. I think TurboNaus is kind of like the big, I don't want to say like the new Flash Hulk, but it's kind of out there in terms of perceived threat. Like people are kind of afraid that when you see your TurboNaus list, you're going to lose to it immediately out of nowhere. So you really, really have to tech against it. And I think there's a lot of ideas on how you're supposed to fight against TurboNaus, and I think it's interesting to now take the people who play it and actually tell you how you should play against it. Before I dive into, or before I bring in the players talking about their lists, I think it's important to kind of differentiate the different types. Like there's many flavors of TurboNaus now. There's like purely proactive. This is the Roger Silas. This is Codie. Compared to other TurboNaus lists, those are the most proactive versions. I don't even count Golos there anymore. Golos used to be quick, but Roger came out and just kind of like, Roger and Codie came out and kind of like Niv Mizzet, like food chain style. Golos was just like sunsetted. But those are your super fast TurboNaus lists, really easy to just like win on turn 1 or 2, just because you have Roger there to like sacrifice to pay for like a Culling the Weak or like Infernal Plunge, or Codie being able to quickly play Codie and then being able to quickly get Profane Tutor and play out your combo that way. Those are your super proactive TurboNaus list. Then we also have a TurboNaus list that can grind. So what this is most famously, I think, is BlueFarm. This is your iKraum. This is your iKraum, Timna. Yeah, I would count that there as well. Just like all your different partner lists that kind of give you ways to get card advantage or like grind through a game while also being able to like play all the cards that enable you for a fast win. So like BadFarm would also sit in this category. So like Timna Roger, I think Timna Roger would be more proactive, but I think you get the idea. Timna Jessica would be an example of like a TurboNaus list that grinds really, really well. You have Jessica to like kind of kill everything, Timna to help you get cards back as you play a longer game, and in being in Mardu, there's a lot of ways to win. Also, you just kind of play all the same cards as any other TurboNaus list, so that list isn't any like necessarily slower than all the other ones. Lastly, we have the utility TurboNaus list. This is where I would put Golos, and is also where I would put my list for Jeginaws. So Golos is great because when I think Golos was one of the pioneer like TurboNaus lists last year. BlueFarm is the most famous one, I think. BlueFarm Roger Silas is probably the most famous one, but Golos for a while, because of, Squirrel Mob's Metagame Project, I forgot which one, but Golos was like a big one in that one, and that was, I think, one of the lists that really started like bringing attention to TurboNaus, being able to quickly play Golos. Golos gets Boseiju, and people who play reactively or like kind of think about playing more interaction or stop a strategy like that suddenly realize, wow, here's a TurboNaus list that gets an like a land that makes your Adnos uncounterable every time. What do I do now? And you can do it very consistently, very easy to play Golos. I would consider that as like a TurboNaus list with some utility, because that's what Golos does. And Gigantha's the same way. Gigantha, it's very easy for you to cast Gigantha because like Golos, most of it's colorless and you have like a green or a red pip, and then you tap Gigantha to you play a bunch of like different spells to kind of like leverage that colored mana you get to then like support the TurboNaus strategy. So for example, like I like to do things like play Gigantha, tap the next turn, then like use a red and a green, and play a Vexing Shusher, and then you can protect your Ad Nauseam afterwards, or like things like that. You can play Squandered Resources. These are TurboNaus lists that are just kind of using commanders for like a very specific utility for your TurboNaus. They don't necessarily grind as well as the other ones. I mean, Golos technically grinds. If you're stuck, you can activate Golos, but it's nothing like a Tymna Kraum. Like Tymna Kraum, you're drawing cards off each attack, and also you're getting cards of like 2 cards each. 2 spells each, whatever, you get what I'm saying. So with this many flavors of Turbo Ad Nauseam, TurboNaus, how do we actually fight against all these different strategies? And I think when you ask most players who don't play TurboNaus that often or as much, there's some heuristics that we understand as a community that should face TurboNaus really well. For example, as I mentioned earlier, ways to disrupt their action economy. For example, a rule block, deafening silence, those things can really crush your TurboNaus list because they can't chain their spells anymore, so it's more difficult. Or playing more reactively, holding more interaction, playing like a Thrasios X list where you can play out Thrasios real quick to like Fierce Guardianship something, or just kind of holding mana up, and then threatening interaction, kind of disrupting the TurboNaus that way. I think interaction and also reactively through interaction, proactively through stacks is the 2 main avenues that players will take to play against TurboNaus. But what's interesting today is that we have all these different pilots for what I would consider to be like very popular archetypes of TurboNaus. So they're all going to talk about what is the most, I think, what are big misconceptions that people have about their archetype, and also what impacts their game plan the most, what is most disruptive to them. So we have a bunch of people, all these different decks, so let's just dive into it. So let's start with the author of the TurboNaus Primer, Ondas, and his iKraum brew, iKraum.
A common misconception about iKraum is that we don't really have a good late game into mid-range pods because we don't have Tymna to draw cards with. Even though Ikra doesn't draw cards though, going into the late game means that I've been given enough time for combat damage from my commanders to really start to add up. My opponents are likely getting low on life, and they're going to be forced to try and go for a win attempt before I knock them out of the game. iKraum does a great job of presenting a fairly unique angle of interaction from TurboNaus decks in the form of player removal. Additionally, the Grixis Nas core offers some powerful grind engines such as Rhystic Study, Necropotence, Mystic Remora, and sometimes even the 4-mana Teferi, while also being able to use wheel effects even in the late game as a form of both disruption and to refill your hand. So just as a baseline, we have tools to fight against mid-range decks. Adding Ikra to the mix means that I have an unlimited amount of time to grind with Necropotence, and allows me to use Sylvan Library as a grind engine without needing to worry about going too low. I tend to value hands that set me up with a grind engine more than hands of something like a turn 2 Nas going into stacks, though, because it allows me to play around their turn 1 or 2 stacks piece, better than just looking for a turn 2 Nas and hope that I don't get stopped by Deafening Silence or something. To be honest, the main deck that I'm really afraid of going into pods would be a TurboNaus deck that's ahead of me in turn order, since I can often just die before I get a turn 2. I'm also scared of commanders that can threaten me with commander damage faster than I can. Decks like Kinrith, Korvold, Paco, and Jessica Ishai are all able to kill me faster than I can kill them, which means that I have a much harder time figuring out how to leverage my attacks. Though midrange and stacks pods on their own are perfectly manageable, a pod with both a midrange deck and a stacks deck is something to be scared of. The midrange deck is often able to outvalue the stacks deck that is holding you back, giving the midrange deck plenty of time to set up and take over the game.
Now we have DonConSenapi, giving us his perspective on Rakdos and Mardu farm lists.
Hello, this is DonCon. One of the common misconceptions that I think Naus has is that it loses to stacks pieces or stacks decks and struggles against rule of law in particular. And while I think that these pieces do throw a wrench in the game plan, it's not a bad matchup. Rule of Law is not even the worst stacks piece. I think cards like Trinisphere are a lot more difficult to deal with. And another misconception is that the Naus decks are glass cannons and don't have a good grind game. I think that that's just false. Naus decks can win out of nowhere. They can look very weak at a pod and then all of a sudden have an explosive turn and win. So just bringing them to the late game doesn't make you favored. Now, as a Mardu / Rakdos space pilot, strategies that I worry about are going to generally be other Naus decks, primarily ones with blue in them. Think of BlueFarm, for example, that has 2 very good grind engines. So if they make it to the late game, they're more favored than I am. They have ways to make it to the late game. So if I'm trying to, be more proactive than them, I can get burnt. And generally, they are more favored in the stacks matchups. They have more tools, more flexible tools. And while I have tools to do well in the stacks matchup, I am much more worried about the other Naus player because they have the same tools and more. Other non-Naus decks that I would generally be worried about are going to be decks with these one-card style win conditions or engines that just take over the game. So a card like Survival of the Fittest, very good engine. Cards like Doomsday. Doomsday has fallen out of favor and generally is not a good card, but if there's a deck that's utilizing it well, I would be worried about a deck like that. Divergent, Transformation, Polymorph effects, while they ask you to make, limitations to your deck, they are one card win conditions. So those kinds of things are going to generally be higher on my threat radar than decks that rely off of 2-card combos.
Next we have Deak, speaking on the behalf of Silas Roger.
Hey, this is Deak here. So first question here is, what are common misconceptions that people have regarding how to beat your archetype of TurboNaus? And my archetype, I'm counting as Silas here. I guess I would say how easily it can bounce back. Generally it's true about Silas that it does not have good grind. Silas's ability is terrible. It can help a little bit. His best thing is that he has Death Touch, which makes him a really good blocker. But he can't grind. But despite that, the deck is really payoff dense. It's to help get it all those turn 2 win attempts, which also means that if you get stopped early on, you could just possibly top deck something that gets you back in the game. So that could be something like Mizzix's Mastery, so someone counters your Adnaus or PETA. You might just draw that and then get a free, 4-mana cast of PETA or Adnaus. Could be a Bolus's Citadel. If the game's getting grindy, suddenly Mnemonic Betrayal becomes the best card in the deck. I've consulted for that before when a wheel's gone off or something, and then it just wins the game for you. So that's definitely the misconception, is that if you've dealt with it in those first 2 turns, they're sort of out of the game. That's not necessarily the case. And then the second question here is, what are actual strategies that you worry about are threatened by as a TurboNaus pilot? So the pods I don't like to see. So pod composition is one. You don't want to see a lot of stacks pieces coming your way, because that narrows the strategy down. You normally have all these payoffs that basically involve casting multiple spells. And if you've got lots of people dropping like deafening silences and stuff like that, I try not to even play it into those pods. But randomly play them or maybe switch afterwards. You get in them. But that almost shifts entirely to trying to get Tainted Pact and Thassa's Oracle, because a lot of Stacks decks might not be on blue, but they'll just have difficulty dealing with that end of turn Tainted Pact into Thassa's Oracle on your next turn. Basically becomes the only strategy. So if you kept something that's not that, just hoping to draw into it and hold off for a bit. Other strategies I worry about is if I'm like the only turbo player at the pod and it's mixed or mid-range, really I don't want to see them being not greedy. That is multiple people holding up counter spells around the second turn cycle starts or whenever you get to your second turn. Like if people are really watching you, or like they're giving you a lot of respect and didn't just go all in, that's a problem. You'll have difficulty with Silas getting any sort of advantage after that if they keep you in check the entire time. And that's again a pod composition issue too, because if you and another turbo player or more than 2 turbo players are in the pod, then it really just becomes a race with the interactions that are in those decks, and you don't have to worry about being checked by the entire table. And then finally, worrying about stuff is there's a lot of stacks pieces that I think could see more play that really shut down Silas hard. Counterbalance, for one, sees fringe play, but it's really solid. Like even if you just drew something that counters 0 mana spells once in a while, like if you have land on top, that can really do some damage and really shut down lines. So just early stacks pieces: Chalice of the Void, Deafening Silence. Dranith can certainly help. Grafdigger's Cage, all that stuff you don't want to see too early, but I don't worry about it. Like if it happens, it happens, and that's just the way it goes. And that's all I've got to say on that. So thank you.
Moving on to something a little slower than Silas Roger is Deco from cEDH Brazil talking about Korvold.
Okay, so my archetype of TurboNaus is Korvold, and while Korvold doesn't have all that much of removal, stacks pieces can hurt us, but depending on how the game goes, Korvold can get pretty big and can start hitting the stacks players. So one of the biggest misconceptions that I faced from my opponents is that with enough stacks on the board, Korvold is a dead deck, and this isn't true. They have to be careful with Korvold, because Korvold can get huge pretty quickly and can hit them in the face. They can be hit in a rate much higher than Crown does, because Crown needs at least 6 hits, and Korvold mainly with 3 hits you are able to get there and kill your opponents. So Korvold can be pretty grindy if necessary, and depending on your meta, you can tweak your deck a little bit in order to have more backup plans in case of facing lots of stacks. So I believe that this misconception that stacks kill the deck is something that people should not have it. What are actual strategies that you worry about or are threatened by as a TurboNaus pilot? Well, specifically on Korvold, Who Breacher and this kind of effect is pretty annoying to face, because Korvold's a deck that relies on drawing lots of cards, and as a TurboNaus in general, rule of law effects are pretty annoying as well to face, especially when they have some kind of protection, such as Mother of Runes or any kind of protection like this, because most of our removal are target based, TurboNaus decks don't play Wrath effects. The blue ones, they have Psych Rift mainly, but even some of the blue decks are not even using Psych Rift. They use like spot removal such as Chain of Vapor, Rushing River, and stuff like this because they can double as bouncing your own stuff. Another thing that is pretty annoying to face while playing TurboNaus, especially when you don't have Tessa's Oracle, is Graveyard Hate. Drenith Magistrate, Rest in Peace, Duality, Void Walker are cards that they can stop some of some lines, specifically breach lines and dockside reanimation lines that most of the decks that don't use blue rely on. There's also silence effects, such as silence itself, or the Ranger Captain of Eos, that is a very strong card that can tutor for Hope of Kirapur to double as a silence effect, and it can be sacrificed to stop your opponents, or if they don't try to win, you can sacrifice on your turn to win with protection. I think in general it's mostly these effects.
For another Sans Blue TurboNaus, we have Leptys talking about Abzan Farm.
Hello everyone, this is Leptys, a Finnish cEDH deck brewer and enthusiast. I'm known in some online cEDH circles as a big proponent of TurboNaus decks, which is why today I'm going to give some advice against a very particular one, that being the Abzan colored partner list helmed by Tymna the Weaver and iKraum the Usurper, often referred to as BadFarm or Abzan Farm. Many who play against Abzan Farm after getting their first taste of TurboNaus elsewhere might think that it, like other similar lists, would simply fail to function against aggressive life total pressure and mana denying stacks pieces. However, what Abzan Farm in particular lacks in lightning fast mana potential of bouncing Dockside, for instance, or the vast stack-based interaction suite of blue counterspells, it makes up in resilience against exactly the aforementioned two weaknesses of conventional TurboNaus list: life total pressure and symmetric mana denying stacks. So how it does that is simply through the commanders. Tymna gives the card for the grind, iKraum gives the life. They give the deck the presence of, I guess, an annoying cockroach of sorts, as it's that one nose deck that just can't get beaten down, or at least completely blown out by the table when the game goes longer than the first couple of turns. Besides the commanders, the deck also has a diverse, resilient combo package to maneuver through hate pieces, as well as a healthy balance of mana production between rocks, rituals, creatures, and land ramp. So they cover pretty much every base against at least one or two silver bullet mana denial cards like Null Rod or Cursed Totem. So what people often misunderstand when up against Abzan Farm is that no particular card, aside from like card draw denial, like Hull Breacher, I guess, none of them really hurt the deck's chances of staying in the longer game. Instead, what the deck doesn't like to see are pilots focusing on it as the main threat. The deck is really reliant on Tymna, more so than many other Tymna lists out there. So keeping Tymna off the table or just denying her card draw ensures that the deck has less of a late game. It also has pretty much no counterspells to speak of, so your spot removal will almost never be contested, aside from like Veil of Summer. If the Abzan Farm player already has the Atnos or other payoff waiting in hand, or just has the lucky top deck in the correct situation, it's pretty hard to stop it from going off in those cases. So to prevent those, I guess directing the table at all times to focus on the Abzan Farm player is key to preventing any sneaky wins from occurring, as that's one thing I'm at least trying my best to do when playing that deck.
And last but not least, of course we have to talk about BlueFarm, but today we're gonna have someone who is not only the backup of River, which would be Kazu, but the backup of the backup, who is Cinestra. So Cinestra is gonna be talking about Tymna Kraum.
I think there are two main camps of misconceptions about Sans Green TurboNaus. I think there are a bit of truth in both of them, but they are both two extremes. One camp believes that Sans Green TurboNaus dies at the first site of interaction, or the first stacks piece. The second camp believes that Tymna and Chrome are just not fast enough, and thus should always be played grindy. I think the main misconception that can be understood from these two camps is that many people believe that Sans Green TurboNaus is one-dimensional. The diametrically opposed camps suggest that there is a wide variety in how to play Tymna Chrome. I think the beauty and honestly the strength of Tymna Chrome is in its sheer flexibility. However, I believe this flexibility can also be a weakness to newer players picking up the deck because there are so many different directions to build Sans Green TurboNaus and there's just so many different ways to pilot it. To break down each of the camps, I'll go into each of them individually. The first main misconception is that Tymna Chrome dies at the first site of interaction or the first stacks piece. And I think this could be true for any turbo deck actually. Sometimes you mulligan for a very fast win and you just don't get there. And that's okay because maybe that was your best path to winning. But I think the main problem is when the pilot of Tymna Chrome cannot read the table or cannot adapt to the new situation. It's important to recognize when it might be safe to go for a win, and then even more important to know what to do when it might not be, or what to do to recover. There's a good reason why we are playing Tymna Chrome instead of Golos or Kenrith, and it's because we have two incredibly powerful grind engines in the command zone. These commanders are great to deploy when you think it might not be safe to go for a win, because instead you can start making value plays until it is safe to go for it. Perhaps even develop into something like an overloaded Cyclonic Rift or a Grand Abolisher, or even beat down with both Crom and Sarah Ascendant. Knowing when to switch plans from a turbo idea into more of a grind idea and when it might not be safe to go for it requires a bit of reading the table, so it's not exactly an easy skill to come by out of nowhere. There's also a great amount of skill involved in trying to climb back from the depths of hell. Sometimes you go for it and you get blown out, but with both Tymna and Crom in the command zone, you are never truly out of the race. You need to know how to make comebacks, and I think truly the best players are the ones that are always looking for their best chances of winning the game, no matter what setbacks happen. Another misconception is that Tymna Crom is just not fast enough sometimes. Many opponents will actually assume that Tymna Crom is actually just Opus Thief when you first sit down, and you can already understand how that can be a big misconception. From the pilot side, I think those who think that Tymna Crom is not fast enough might not be mulliganing aggressively enough. The London mulligan combined with the free mulligan thanks to multiplayer is just broken. One of the strengths for Tymna Crom is actually that you can afford to mulligan low and then work off the strengths of your commanders if you weren't able to find fast starts in your first sevens. I think TurboNaus as a whole is usually somewhat weak to stacks decks. I think stacks decks in general are very difficult for new players because new players barely know their own lines, and so having to navigate through unknown obstacles becomes incredibly difficult. I think Tymna and Crom can certainly navigate through stack situations, but it requires some more pilot expertise, knowing what kind of win conditions to go for, what kind of grind engines to look for, what kind of removal to look for. I think a big thing for Tymna Crom specifically is actually just beating down the stacks player with Crom and drawing cards off of Tymna, looking for that Cyclonic Rift and whatnot. I think sometimes what is oversold about Tymna Crom TurboNaus is its actual speed compared to many of the other turbo decks. Things like Rograkh Tymna and Rograkh Silas, I would argue, are consistently faster than Tymna Crom just due to the nature of Rograkh. And I would personally say that Sans White or 5-color TurboNaus are usually slightly faster than Tymna Crom just because they have access to more rituals usually. While I still think we still most likely have the upper hand and can go for very fast wins as well, I definitely think that these are facts to consider, that they could be faster than us when looking at my mulligan hands. Of course, things like turn orders are really important to consider here as well. I know this card is really threatening to a lot of decks, but I think a common hate piece that is found in most decks that is pretty annoying for Tymna Crom is actually Hullbreacher. If you're not having a turbo game, a lot of times you're depending on both Tymna and Crom for value into the mid to late game, and Hullbreacher just shuts off both Tymna and Crom, unfortunately. I would say that most players have around the same 80 to 85 cards for iKraum TurboNaus recently. The last 15 to 20 cards are usually either personal preference cards or cards that attack particular metas. There's a lot of flexibility even among iKraum players and lists. It might sound a bit out there, but I think that the best way to learn how to play against iKraum is to really understand the player. Knowing how they like to play and how they like to react to certain situations can be a big indicator on how they like to construct their deck. And by understanding the player, you can really understand their deck and their choices.
As demonstrated by all the different TurboNaus pilots and brewers for the different archetypes, I think it's safe to say like it's true that, you know, rule of law and playing interaction that does impact the strategy. That's nothing new. But I think what's most interesting is something that Cinestra was touching upon. And I hate using Cinestra, but he's right. So he's right sometimes, most of the time. But the important part here is, aside from the fact that you should be playing stacks, or you should be playing like interaction to interface with these or like fight these TurboNaus strategies, what's most important is that, and this kind of applies to everything, is that TurboNaus is kind of hard to pilot. Like most lists, there's a very clear skill indicator for the pilot playing that deck. Someone playing TurboNaus really, like someone who knows how to play TurboNaus really well, is very different from someone who just picked up TurboNaus. 1 life, 5 life. So what I'm getting at here is like when Cinestra was talking about playing, kind of like learning your opponents, learning the pod when you're playing against these strategies, right? Knowing how someone will react to a certain thing. Well, when, let's say I'm playing a stacks deck, and I'm playing against a TurboNaus player, I know if I'm playing against someone who's very experienced, like Ondas or Cinestra or Leptys or anyone who was just talking just now, they know how to play around my stacks really well, because they just know their deck inside out. They also know how to pivot very well. So what does that mean? That means when I'm mulliganing for my stacks pieces, I know that I can't. First of all, I have to first disrupt their TurboNaus strategy, so your deafening silence. But then I have to. I think this is the key part, is learning how to disrupt their like lean back or fall back strategy. Because as we've heard from every single pilot here, they know how to play around stacks very well. They know how to play around interaction very well. I think that was one of the common misconceptions, is that they fold to interaction. Even Deak, it talked about how it's a common misconception there, because you stop there ad nauseam, you think Silas Roger can't come back, but Silas Roger has built, like, it has more payouts built in where you can top deck a Mythic Mastery and go again. Like, there's a lot of fallback strategies, and they're completely ready to play against like what we think are easy ways to shut down Turbo Ad Nauseam. But when you read an opponent who knows how to play around that, you need to first disrupt their Ad Nauseam, then you disrupt their backup strategy really well. So what does that mean? This means if you're playing against like a BlueFarm, you turn off their TurboNaus, you turn off their card draw with like a Spirit of the Labyrinth. That, I think, doing those two things would really disrupt their strategy, because then now they don't have their way to dig back to like stop both of your things. They either they have the Ad Nauseam, they find the thing to like get rid of your stacks piece to play the Ad Nauseam, or they have to find the thing to start grinding again. I think it's important to think about first disrupting their Ad Nauseam, then disrupting their strategy. I think focusing on what kind of strategies they fall back onto is very important here. But also, going back to like an earlier point, if you're playing against someone who doesn't know how to pivot very well, in that case you would know to if we're keeping the stacks analogy or example here. As a stacks player, I know in that case I'm gonna double up my stacks to fight their win cons. I'm gonna do like deafening silence, and maybe my hand has a rest in peace. So then if they want to try and go for like an underworld breach line, they have two things to worry about. Then if we slam down a torpor orb, they're in a lot of trouble there as well, because they can't then fall back into a Thassa's Oracle strategy there. Also, don't forget Psych Rift. Psych Rift is like the bane of all stacks decks. All TurboNaus lists that runs blue, I think, should be playing Psych Rift nowadays. They're just very ready for it. So I think it's also important to keep in mind that just because you shut off a TurboNaus list doesn't mean that they're out of the game forever. It's very, very easy for them to come back. So you also have to keep in mind to try and be proactive yourself as well. As soon as you get a little breathing room, don't get comfortable. You have to like push for your own win there as well, because even though you have a window, that doesn't mean you shut out their window as well. I just went on a really long ramble and talked really quickly, so I'm going to do a quick recap and just end the video. So basically, what we've learned from listening to all these players and listening to me talking is that TurboNaus lists aren't as one-dimensional as we think. On the surface level, we know how to disrupt them. We impact their action economy, as I said. Deafening sounds real long. We find ways, perhaps, to stack like their win cons as well. Turbo Orb for the Thassa's Oracle, rest in peace for the Underworld Breach. But most importantly, I think people don't recognize or consider that even though the deck is one-dimensional, the pilots know how to pivot around it, and there's built-in plans to play around your disruption. So it's important to recognize those strategies for each of these archetypes and fight against that as well, because once you stop their way to grind or their fallback strategy, then it makes it very difficult for a TurboNaus player, I think, to really stay in that game. And of course, it's a whole pot of players, so you can't just dedicate all of that to play against a TurboNaus player. But what this means is, if you're playing with a stacks player, another, like there's double stacks, or if you're playing with like, I don't know, another like, just a more interactive deck, you play Deafening Silence, and you call out that, if you're all worried about their Korvold player, if you call out that we have to find a way to shut off that Korvold as well, that's one less player all of you have to worry about. It makes it very difficult for that Korvold player to then like kind of explode. You kind of put them in a position where they have to either contribute to the game and try and disrupt the other players, or make them really, really work for that win. And I completely missed Cinestra's point earlier, but I think it's also very important just to recognize the players themselves. Some players just, they might not go for the fallback strategy. The way they pivot around certain kinds of disruption is very personal, and it's just important to recognize that. If you're playing with a newer player, they might not know how to pivot around certain types of disruption. Maybe you put down like a Deafening Silence and a Rest in Peace. They're not the type, they might not be the type of person to then like kind of really play it through. They might be someone who's like, I'm out, I'm done. And putting them in that mental state might be enough to like beat them, which is like kind of an awful thing to say, but like sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes you're playing a combo deck and you kind of just see this perceived like wall of interaction or like disruption. You're like, God, I don't want to play this game anymore. But if you recognize that you're playing against someone that's really, really experienced in their deck, then you know what your strategy is as well to fight them specifically, because they might be playing around specifically expecting you to disrupt them. Maybe they didn't keep a fast hand, they kept a hand of Cyclonic Rift and just wait a little longer, let you play out all your rocks, and Cyc Rift everything and win. So I think that's what's important, is recognize those strategies and also recognizing the pod and the players to fight against TurboNaus decks. I think that can be applied to a lot of different decks, but I think especially so for TurboNaus, because TurboNaus is very obvious as an archetype. It's very flashy, and it seems like it's very, very direct, because we all know you're just making mana and playing it ad nauseam when it's safe or when it's not safe. I don't know, but we just don't really think about the other aspects of the deck as much. Which, unlike other decks, because they're not quite as like explosive, you're kind of mentally like thinking about all the different things about that deck. Like, oh, it's a Tymna Thrasios deck, it can grind, it can do XYZ. But when you're playing like a Tymna Crom TurboNaus list, you're thinking that it can grind, but you're not thinking the Crom can also kill you. You're thinking about like the Ad Nauseam, or same thing for Roger Silas. So I think I made my point here. I hope this was helpful, and I'm excited to just hear everyone to talk about it. I think it's very cool. This video was recorded before the Hull Breacher ban. So you might have heard some things about how Hull Breacher is a big like disruption piece against TurboNaus. And unfortunately, it's gone now. So good luck.